Okay, so first up is Dr. John Waldman. Dr. Waldman joined the faculty at Queens College as a tenured professor of biology in 2004. For the previous 20 years, he was employed by the Hudson River Foundation for Science and Environmental Research. He received his PhD in 1986 from the joint program in evolutionary biology between the American Museum of Natural History and the City University of New York, and an MS in Marine and Environmental Sciences from Long Island University. His research interests focus on the ecology and evolution of fishes, the historical ecology of rivers and urban waterways, and estuarine biology. Dr. Waldman has authored more than 90 scientific articles, numerous essays in the New York Times and elsewhere, and several popular books, including the award-winning Heartbeats in the Muck, The History of the Sea Life and Environment of New York Harbor, Still the Same Hawk, Reflections on Nature in New York, and most recently, Running Silver, Restoring Atlantic Rivers and Their Great Fish Migrations. So Dr. Waldman, please take it away.
Thank you, Vicki. It's really exciting to see what's happening on Long Island. I've been kind of looking at the situation across New York State, and Long Island is the hotbed of interest in restoring rivers. You're way ahead of the rest of the state, and it's nice that it's happening organically among different private and government entities. I'm going to give sort of an abbreviated version of my stump speech, which is an hour long. We don't have time for it today, about the big picture of Diadromous Fish Restoration. So it's going to be a little more concentrated and briefer, and then I'm going to ratchet down to, I think, issues that are more relevant to Long Island in particular. So why it comes down to dams. I can make the case that in terms of restoring diadromous fish, we have lost our traction on all the other issues, the other reasons why diadromous fish are not doing well, and that if we want to make a difference, it really does come down to dams, because that's the one place where we have traction on these issues. So in terms of the fish we're concerned about, we have about a little more than a dozen species along the Northeast, which is more than anywhere else in the world. I think we have more diadromous fish in on the Atlantic coast than anywhere else I can find around the planet. And what's interesting about them is that they are really diverse in terms of their evolutionary history. If you look at them, you see everything from fish as primitive as a sea lamprey to its derived as a striped bass. And this has evolved, this unique life history has evolved independently in various groups of fish, and it's a very specialized life history. There are about 20,000 species of fish on the planet, and only about 200 are diadromous. So not many have this life history. I circled the shad and the river herring because I feel like if we can deal with those species, we actually can solve the rest of them. And I say that because if we solve shad, we solve the penetration of all fish into big rivers. Shad need to get far into big rivers. You solve them, everything else follows. River herring are a different story because they are fish more of little systems. And just a little bit about the background of this life history. There are benefits, obviously. We know that rivers ran silver with huge numbers of these fish in early days. They flourished when left alone. We think that the reason why they move inland and make this migration to inland waters is that there are relative mortality differences between the habitats. The ocean is a place full of hungry mouths and big teeth, and it's not a good place to be born. Whereas if you're left as an egg way upriver in a relatively oligotrophic environment, there's a good chance that you can hatch and drift downstream into a much richer estuary and use that as an area to develop biomass and then go risk life in the sea. So there are relative mortality differences and relative food resource differences between these habitats. But there's also costs, and one of the costs are the physiological adjustments. If you took a freshwater fish and dumped it in salt water or vice versa, it would die within a few minutes. So these fish have to make this osmotic switch. And there's also a cost in terms of migrations. There's bioenergetic costs. It takes a lot of energy to swim from somewhere out in the North Atlantic to a natal river, and there's predation risk along the way. So another sort of unseen cost is the fact that they're relying on the suitability of two habitats. You need to have a healthy river and a healthy ocean. And that provides two risks. And one of my colleagues put this nicely. He said that historical advantages, where they took advantage of these differences between these habitats, have now become contemporary curses because we have basically screwed our rivers in a big way. Not that we're doing great in the ocean either, but I think the problem is really with the rivers. So one fundamental question people ask about anadromy is why home? And why do these fish come back to their natal rivers? And there is one exception. Sea lamprey do not come back. And I've worked on that, and it's an interesting story. I don't have time for that today. But we think that they home because of the certainty of habitat suitability. If you're a fish in the ocean wandering along the shore and you sense a river, you don't know for a fact that that river is suitable for your species' reproduction. It may be totally unsuitable. But if you home to a river that you were born in, it's already been certified. It produced you. And this circularity allows for the continuity of these populations. But there's repercussions to that. There's consequences, and they're good. One of them is the fine-tuning to its own migratory circuit. If you look at fish stocks in rivers along the coast, we find morphological differences, we find genetic differences, we find differences in the maximum size attained, we find differences in the first year of reproduction. There's a lot of fine-tuning that goes on in terms of that population being best evolved and suited to that particular river. The ocean does not provide a lot of evolutionary force because from the point of view of the ocean, these fish are experiencing the same waters, but the rivers are different, and that's where the fine-tuning emerges, and in fact, you end up with what has been called races of fish that we pretty much lost. There's life history variation that is critical to these stocks really flourishing. You want to have different life histories within a river system because that's a resilience providing factor. It's a sort of a bet hedging strategy. And because we've shrunken so many of these populations now to little relic stocks, we've lost that variation, which was very important. So these fish are also highly iconic. This is one of my favorite lithographs. It's from the Hudson from 1886, and it shows a sturgeon, a striped bass, and a shad, and a fishing camp in the background. And I like to point out that it's not an accident that it's showing three anadromous fish and not a yellow perch and a white sucker or whatever. These are the fish that are born in the river, go to the ocean, harvest the biomass of the river, and deliver it predictably to inland waters every year. And they were responsible for helping colonists make it in this country. I also love to show this postcard that I found in an antique shop years ago. It's from the 1930s, and it shows a little tiny river in Cape Cod. And in Cape Cod, there's a tremendous interest in river herring. Every other river seems to be called either the Herring River or the Mill River, which were the two uses, for rivers in those days. And this river is a small system in North Harwich, and it shows a stream that's been sort of co-opted for alewife production. So the stream's been sort of straightened here. You have a holding pool where the fish come up and can be seined. You see a seine net pulling fish out of the water here. This is the spawning area with a little dam. And the fish can be put in these barrels and shipped right to the market. And I researched this, and this produces as many as 40,000 barrels a year of alewives. And the beauty of this, and this shows in a microcosm the promise and the peril of these kinds of fish. These fishermen, if they went looking for these river herring in the ocean in February or in October, would not find a single specimen. And yet, they know that in late March or early April, within a few days of a certain date, they will come marching into their nets. And it's incredibly predictable, incredibly cooperative, but it puts them at tremendous peril. So if you're a smart fisheries manager, you take some fish, but you allow enough to get through to sustain the population. And this is what we've done to rivers, large rivers, in a microcosm along the entire coast. Take care of your river, and you'll have a sustainable fishery forever. Screw it up in some way with pollution or not allowing enough fish to spawn, blocking their migrations, and you're in trouble. So one of the things I enjoyed looking at when I was working on my book, Running Silver, was looking at quotes of how many fish were seen in the old days. And these quotes are not quantitative. I can't say there were 100,000 fish or 2 million fish. But there was quote after quote after quote of what the Europeans saw and how they were blown away by the abundances. So I put in red such multitudes as almost incredible, such abundance as is incredible, and my all-time favorite, in a word, it is unbelievable, indeed undescribable, as also incomprehensible. What quantity is down there, one must behold oneself. And I don't know how many fish were there, but there were a hell of a lot of fish. So compare that to today, river herring today in the Northeast. I was just up at the herring run in Cape Cod this spring, and a place that used to provide lots of bait for striper fishermen is closed down. Looking at the pattern of decline, river herring in blue from 1950 to 2010, tremendous decline. And that's not even counting the losses that occurred way before that. If you look state by state, you have total closures or near total closures. And this was a fish that was likened to passenger pigeons in their abundance. And nowadays, in many places, you can't even keep one. So it's not a great situation. What's changed in terms of these migratory fish? Well, one thing that my colleague Karen Lindberg and I looked at was we looked at several metrics. One of them is size, and there's not a lot of good information on size changes. The best information I found was actually in John McPhee's wonderful book, The Founding Fish, about shad, where he said that early in the 1800s in the Susquehanna, shad packed 40 to the barrel, and later in the 1800s they packed 100 to the same size barrel. So there was a major decline in size. In shad, we don't see big Atlantic sturgeon very often anymore, although I think that will change because they're protected these days. If you haven't been to the Hyde Park Post Office on the east side of the Hudson, you can go and see that mural. That's one of the images of the history of the Hudson around the top of the post office, and sturgeon got big in those days. So we looked quantitatively, Karen Lindberg and I, at species and population persistence, and we looked at 22 species that are found either in Europe alone, North America alone, or both. And we found that about half had insufficient data because they're not commercially important. But all the others lost populations. American shad had lost about half of their populations, and about a third of North Atlantic salmon populations have been extirpated. But the real sort of killer analysis was the abundance analysis. So we have here on the left side the American shore, and on the right side the European shore. And what you see in almost every case, except for the striped bass, which had a well-known recovery because it had a single driver that was really depleting it, and that was overfishing, and it was corrected. You see this. And there's two possibilities here. One is that they're all simultaneously heading down towards zero, and they're going to crash. Or more likely, they decline, and then there's some resilience that kicks in, and keeps them going in a sort of abysmally small level. I call it riding the asymptote. So you have a lot of populations where you have tiny numbers of fish, but they're hanging in there. So that gives you something to work with. When you looked at the time series, the 31 time series of North Atlantic fish, relative abundances declined 98% from historic highs in 13 and 90% in an additional 11. So tremendous changes over time. Just looking at a few case histories, Atlantic salmon in the US, not counting Canada, it's estimated there were up to about 500,000 when the colonists first came here, although one of my friends at the Atlantic Salmon Federation said that number is too low. In 2014, there were less than 400, and they're federally endangered in Gulf of Maine rivers. I think probably the most moving story to me is what happened to Susquehanna River shad. Most Atlantic rivers had shad, but Susquehanna was the shad river. It just was, it had the right morphology, the right characteristics to have ridiculous numbers of shad in the old days. And here you see shad being landed in one of the sites, and of course, shad bakes were a popular part of the history of that area. Shad were really important. They ran into Lock Haven and Lake Otsego in the center of New York State, all the way from Chesapeake Bay, and they fed the valley. There were shad vendors who would come around and blow a horn and yell "shadow" and sell shad to to the housewives who would come out and buy shad. And then there were some really notable catches too and sightings. There was one fishery in Pennsylvania called the Stump Farm Fishery, where they would post somebody on a hill with binoculars, and he could actually see the water bulge as the shad came upriver. It would just start to change shape because the huge flow was making the water, putting it in turmoil. There was another famous haul right at the mouth of the river where they set this very long net, and northwest wind blew up, and they couldn't haul the net in for 3 days, and it filled up with fish. And then after the wind changed, it took another 3 days to land it, and it was estimated it had 15 million shad and river herring in it. Just one haul. So what happened to this river? Well, it was dammed in 4 locations in the lower river, starting with the Conowingo, which leaves only 10 miles of river below it. So the next 500 miles is lost to these fish. And there were a series of dams built, and they were later retrofitted with fishways that don't work well. And just in terms of people's perspective on looking at, the idea of shifting baselines and not remembering what was lost, I'd like to show this image, which is for the Peconic River. Karin Lindbergh found this. And these are shad landings in the Peconic River from 1887 to about 2000. And you look at this and you think, oh, this is horrific. But look at where 1887 is now. This proves the importance of looking back in time. This is 1887 versus 1814. So our perspectives really have to focus on original numbers and deep time to have a real sense of how much has been lost. So what can be done about this? As I said, I think it comes down to dams. And I want to talk about the other drivers. We have those that are largely rectified, those that are essentially untractable, those that are tractable and mostly applied, and then we have, obviously, tractable but unrectified, which is dams, no mystery there. So largely rectified. Pollution, I think, has not been, when I was first getting interested in these fish, it was always, dams, overfishing, and pollution in that order. I think pollution has not, in most cases, except in a few cases, been that huge a problem for these fish. They're spending a lot of time, in those cases, in the ocean. Industrial contaminants don't usually kill fish, they usually just have sublethal effects, which are hard to measure. There were instances like the Delaware River where there was such low oxygen in the spring, they called that block a chemical dam, in effect. And there are still cases today, even of pig farms, losing vast amounts of waste and having major fish killed. But for the most part, since the Clean Water Act, we're doing a pretty good job on water quality to the level where it's not probably impeding the recovery of these fish. So I think that's largely rectified. Then we have those that are tractable, in fact, easily tractable. Overfishing, theoretically, all you have to do is catch less, and you've solved overfishing. I know there are social issues with that, with trying to get people to change their ways, and it's not an easy thing, even though it appears simplistic. But because of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which has kind of counteracted the tragedy of the commons that existed before states worked together to work on preserving species and stocks as a group, has really done a good job. And it's not perfect. There may be some species that are overfished this year or that year, but for the most part, we have really gotten a good handle on overfishing, and we showed that with the striped bass, where we had a fantastic recovery from an overfished stock. Then we have tractable and mostly applied, and I put into this category power plants. We don't typically think much about power plants anymore, but if you're old enough to remember the battles on the Hudson involving Indian Point and Storm King Mountain and other power plants, this was a raging environmental issue in the 60s and 70s. It was the issue. And the issue was that power plants entrain and impinge little fish and kill vast numbers of them. And the numbers of eggs and larvae that are still killed today are staggering. The solution is to build closed cycle cooling. Most of these plants have open cycle cooling, where they're constantly taking new water from the river, heating it up and discharging it, and essentially cooking the fish. By having closed cycle, you can reuse the same water and use very little new water and cause very little harm. The thought was that we would move quickly towards that as recent decades progressed, but because we have so much, a need for so much power, we're still keeping the old plants running, and this is still causing harm. But I think down the road, there won't be any plants built that don't have closed cycle cooling. So eventually we're going to age out of this issue. Then we have the essentially untractable, and I think there's nothing we can do about this, and that's non-native species. As I said, I think the theory is that these fish move into these rivers to lay their eggs in places that are safe. And when you look at the non-native species in rivers along the East Coast, almost every single system, like for instance in New England, where largemouth bass are not native, they're in every single river, and they're basically vacuum cleaners with fins. They're major predators. We have snakeheads. We have big catfishes now in East Coast rivers that didn't exist. We're seeing a lot of predators being introduced to systems where they will never be removed again. You cannot get them out of the system once they're there. And we also have species that compete in various ways, like the zebra mussel has been shown to have a negative effect on pelagic fish like shad and striped bass in the Hudson system. So this is untractable, it's here to stay, it's bad that it happened, and we can't go backwards. Then we have climate change. And a great case history of a stock responding to climate change is the rainbow smelt, which is the cold water boreal species that used to run into the Delaware River up to 1900, and it ran into the Hudson until the late 1990s, and it used to be caught in big numbers up to the 70s, dip net in people's backyards. They have not been seen in the Hudson since about 2000, and they disappeared from Connecticut, and they're becoming scarce in Massachusetts, and it's clearly a case of a species retreating as waters warm. At the same time, gizzard shad, a warm water species, is moving its way up the coast. So climate change, I know we're signing various international agreements and all that. This is not going to change anytime quickly. We have so much momentum towards warmth that it would be crazy to think that this is going to reverse. So we're going to see more changes, and not only changes in the distribution, but changes in the timing of migrations, and also in the amount of water coming into these systems. A lot of these systems count on freshwater runoff from snowmelt. Well, we're not getting the snowmelt anymore. So we could have, this could be a huge ecological monkey wrench. So what is tractable but still unrectified? Obviously dams. That's the one case where we have these remnants of the Industrial Revolution or large hydro plants that maybe should be thought about in different ways that exist out there that are causing tremendous harm to these fish. And looking at shad, for instance, over time, this is a map of the original penetration of shad into the interior waters along the East Coast, and my colleague Carmen estimated that we've lost 40% of this habitat to these fish. In the Hudson Valley, here right in New York State, we have a tremendous legacy of dams. On the right is all dams on record. And you can see how, as the valley filled up with people, farmers first, and then the Industrial Revolution, we had dams added everywhere. Originally, the only sources of power before we had electricity were animals and water, and the water was used. So we have roughly 800 dams on record in the Hudson Valley, and it wasn't until this year that the first 2 came out. There's tremendous opportunities in the Hudson Valley to do good. These are like clogged arteries, and we need to get this stuff out. I think there's actually a lot of hope. There's a new wave of interest in this happening, especially through a new program involving the Nature Conservancy, and DEC is now getting more invested in this too. So I'm hopeful that we'll see some changes in the Hudson Valley, but there's tremendous opportunities. We also looked, some colleagues and I, at the record of passage of fish in large Atlantic rivers, and we chose 3 of them: the Merrimack in Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, the Connecticut, and the Susquehanna. And here you see the thousands of American shad passed over the dams. And they're not actually very large numbers, but I don't want to focus on that image. This is more important. This is the number of fish passed as a percent of the target. And the targets are not ambitious. The targets are like, for the Susquehanna, 750,000 in a system that probably had tens of millions. And yet when you look at the green line as percent of that unambitious target, there's nothing there, basically. And the Merrimack had one little spike where it did okay for a little while. The Connecticut has not done very well. But this is the sort of what I consider the killer slide in terms of finding fault with large river fishways. And this is the passage efficiency. So the blue line for each of the 3 rivers is the percent of fish that pass the first dam that make it to the second dam. And one of the things about large hydro dams and fishways is that you have the advantage, you can count the fish. You can count every fish that comes through because they're coming through some kind of a chamber. So there's no mysteries here. And then the red line is the first to last dam. And you see that it's flat line for the Merrimack, it's close to 0 for the Connecticut, and it's close to 0 for the Susquehanna. So basically, there's almost no fish getting through. In Susquehanna, where I told you those stories about those huge catches, a couple of years ago, 8 fish made it past the second dam. 8 fish. So they're performing very badly. But the beauty of this analysis is that you can no longer say that the poor runs are because of unknown factors at sea: overfishing, pollution, made-up climate change, ecological changes, because it's now a closed system. You know how many fish passed the first dam? They're in the system now. The only thing that's going to prohibit them from getting upriver are the sequential dams. And I think one dam in a system is not fatal to these runs, but when you have several dams in a row, what the fish have to figure out where they're going from they figure out one fishway, they end up in a big reservoir, there's no current, they figure out where the current is, they come to another fishway, it's different, they finally find the current to go up that one. In the end, they're losing weeks of time, and they're not getting on the spawning grounds at the appropriate time, and there's very little facility for downriver movement of these adults. A lot of times we have runs that are based on first-time spawners, where the second time and third times are sacrificed. And these first-time spawners are little guys who don't have a lot of eggs. So there's very little room here, there's very little scope for actual expansion of population. One of the ways that they're getting around this is with the, and I like to make fun of it actually, Operation Fish Run migration via the internal combustion engine. They put fish in trucks and they move them past the dams. And they're proud of this. I would not be proud, I think it's pathetic that fish have to do this. But in any event, it actually works better because they get the pain over with in an hour or two. And when the Susquehanna was having signs of recovery, it was because the trucks were working, not because the fishways were working. So there's now a 50-year reauthorization for the Susquehanna where they're tweaking a few things, and they're asking for a certain level of performance, but they're letting them out of it because if they don't get the performance from the fishways, they're going to allow them to truck the fish up. So not a happy situation. One of the most interesting things I've been looking at lately, and I have a student working on this now, is why fish ladders on the large Atlantic rivers perform so poorly. And I think it may be a question of scale, at least to some degree. This is the Rainbow Dam on the Farmington, and it's a very steep ladder which is supposed to pass salmon and shad, but it's been called the world's biggest fish descaler because it's so rough. The fish get banged up, and a lot of them don't even make it through. They come back down, they look like hell. They're actually replacing this with a fish elevator. But the exception to fishways working well are the Columbia River, where you have a non-native run of shad that reaches about 3 million a year, and they go up this fish ladder here, and they go past the viewing screen where you can see them coming by in tremendous numbers. This fish ladder is bigger than some East Coast shad rivers. There's 2,000 to 3,000 cubic feet of water flowing through the Bonneville Dam fish ladder, and the other ones upstream are huge too. And the river as a whole has a huge amount of water. Compare 2,000 to 3,000 CFS for the Bonneville ladder versus the Peconic River in Rhode Island, which is a shad river. Its total flow is 675 cubic feet per second. So it's not clear we have enough water on the East Coast in these rivers to both produce abundant hydro and good fish runs. And I think we have to make some choices about that. So I want to come back to river herring now. And river herring are a different story than big rivers and shad and salmon. For one thing, these are river herring plunging up a natural brook where there's plunge pools and they just kind of go from level to level. A fish ladder is basically very close to a little brook. So they're not, a shad is a big river fish. It doesn't want to go up the skinny chute and get banged around. River herring are used to this. So fish ladders actually work pretty well with river herring. And I think there's an awful lot of good work going on with fish ladders for river herring. The very best tool, of course, is removal. And there's been a groundswell of interest and action in removing dams, but for the most part, they're not typically big dams. We have the dam on the Kennebec, and there are the Elwha on the west coast, but we're not really, in many cases, because of all the societal forces involved with the benefits and costs of a dam, doing a good job on big dams yet. But there's a general movement towards taking dams down. And I think one of the things we should be thinking about is, in addition to selling it in terms of the fish benefits and the overall ecological benefits, and ecological benefits also in terms of the resident species, because resident species need to move up and down rivers too. It's not just diadromous fish. Aging dams in the country, especially on the East Coast, where they were built earlier, and they are middle-aged or old and facing obsolescence. So we should be thinking about the fact that a lot of these dams will have to come down anyway in the next half a century, and should be thinking about their longevity and what we can do with them. Many of them need repairs. You may remember last year in South Carolina in October, there was that incredible storm. It broke open 18 dams, and I think 17 people died. And we're going to have greater storms from climate change, more pronounced rainfalls. They're going to test these dams. So I think dam safety should be tied into the overall thrust. The great Atlantic Coast precedent is the Edwards Dam on the Kennebec, which came down in 1999. It produced very little energy, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, actually agreed to allow this to happen, which set a great precedent. And it opened up 17 miles of river to main stem spawners like shad and sturgeon, but it also allowed access for the first time in over 100 years to the Seatuck River, which is a tributary that is just a perfect little alewife spawning tributary. So the Seatuck took off and went from 0, because no fish could reach it, to almost 3 million in a few years, despite the fact that they had a fish elevator very down low in the river. But the people who worked on the elevator actually got totally into this and just kept tweaking it until they got it to work right. And it became locally sort of famous. They started a alewife festival up there now. Lobster fishermen come and get their bait to bring back to the coast. And it supported so many eagles that one day they flew a helicopter over it to flush them out, and they counted 50-something eagles that were making a living on the alewife run. So it was a tremendous recovery, and it shows you how fast you'll get a response if you take a dam down. So looking at Long Island, we have very low relief. We don't have any major dams. But what we do have, especially on the South Shore, is a lot of these little creeks that come off the moraines that drain into the South Shore bays, and many of them have small dams that are part of park ponds. And in a lot of those cases, I think we're not going to be allowed to take the dams down. Other cases, we will. One thing we should be thinking about are new tools, and one of them that I like a lot is nature-like fishways. Nature-like fishways are fish ladders that wrap around dams. This is the dam on the Naugatuck River in Seymour, and it opened up in the fall, I think it was 2 years ago, and great press. The head of the agency, the National Resources Agency, was there, and Senator Blumenthal. Hillary was supposed to be there, but she couldn't make it. But it was a big deal, and they built this because they couldn't take the dam down. It was close to the pilings that support Route 8 overpass. So they simply wrapped an artificial stream around the edge of it, and it looks like a real stream. And once they improve the passage downstream, theoretically, fish should be shooting up this. We have a great example of this, and Byron Young is here in the audience. He was very responsible for making this happen on the Peconic River, where we have a nature-like fishway that's working beautifully. And it may be possible in some cases where you can preserve a park pond and yet have a nice scenic kind of addition to allow fish to wrap around those dams. Overall, I'd say that if you give these fish a chance, they will come, because they are driven. This is a famous image of a chum salmon crossing a road in Alaska. And I was in Alaska and I saw pink salmon going through a culvert and then sort of climbing a rocky hill that had water flowing down it, almost like they were, hikers to get their eggs upstream. There's tremendous drive for these fish to get there. You just have to give them a chance. And in my book, I came up with this phrase that every dam should have an existential crisis. And I think we should have T-shirts printed with this. We should be testing or questioning the existence of every dam as to whether it has enough benefit or not to persist through time, and many of them don't. So for Long Island and elsewhere in general, I'd say that dam removal is clearly preferred, but that there are many instances where fish ladders are much better than nothing for river herring, and that we need to do one or the other, but we need to do something. Thank you. Do we have time for a couple of questions?
Yes, we finished a little early, so yeah, we've got 5 to 10 minutes for questions.
Yes.
I wonder about at what point does the population get so low that there is no, I guess, going back and getting it back up the river, even if we were able to do everything we need to do to improve the spawning conditions? Are there times when you just get to the point where the population is so low, the species that?
Well, a couple of responses. One is that if it got so low, you could always stock from elsewhere. So you wouldn't have to rely necessarily on the original fish that time with no stock. In cases where they are very low, like in the Bronx River, where they haven't used the fish ladder yet, the river herring that was built 2 years ago, next year they're going to stock fish from Connecticut above it and get them to hopefully home to there. So you can work with non-native fish. But if you have a relic stock, theoretically, they can expand. What you're not going to get back right away is the life history variation that existed when it was a large stock that may have had fish that came in early to one tributary, came in late to another tributary. That will take time to redevelop. But these fish are very plastic, and there's even still a lot of hidden life history diversity that you wouldn't see looking at fish that you do see by looking at their otoliths. So people who have been working with ear bones these days are finding, for instance, in the case of striped bass at the Hudson, there are males that spend their entire life in fresh water. There are a lot of fish that come down to the estuary that don't go to sea, and there are a lot of fish that go make long migrations to as far as Nova Scotia. So they may not be obviously different or even quantitatively different using heuristics and morphometrics or genetics because there's too much mixing, but you have life history variation there. So what you want to do is basically recomplexify rivers. Right now, many of these rivers have dams where you get a relic stock that compensates for its tiny size by, instead of having a 3-month spawning season over the whole river, they have a 2-week spawning season over a tiny little area. So that's the way they persist through time, is by aggregating in a much smaller window geographically and temporally. But if you open up the river again, I think you would start to see these various life histories start to take hold, and you would see resilience kick in, because the beauty of having multiple life histories is that if one life history doesn't do well one year because of those conditions, another one might. And you get better persistence, and you also get greater utilization of the entire system. So I would not be discouraged by the fact that you have a small stock. It's a whole lot better than nothing, and if you give it a chance, chances are it'll come back. Byron?
John, in the case of the Susquehanna, where they get through the Conowingo Dam, and you said there were only a few, less than 10, that made it through the second dam.
No, the fourth dam.
Fourth dam.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, the fourth dam.
That 1 year, I think they had 10,000, 2,500, roughly 1,000, and then 4. Or 8, I'm sorry.
Could that be that the number getting through the first dam is so small they don't fill up the available spawning habitat in those pools between the dams?
That's been argued.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to be much spawning going on between the dams. No.
That would be the follow-up.
They're largely reservoirs. There isn't a lot of good sort of
Good
riverine
habitat.
spawning habitat.
So there's no reproductive,
I'm not saying there's none, but it
Limited-
doesn't seem to be
reproduction.
doesn't
Okay.
seem to be much of a factor.
yeah,
And there's no provision to get back downstream. So
that's true too.
yeah, I think the dead end fact that you're basically taking fish and putting tiny fish up there at once to spawn,
Mhm.
you need, there's something called the storage effect, where you need to have enough total eggs produced over time to compensate for the bad years.
Yes.
And this is like a ratchet. Maybe in a good year you can hold your own, but in a bad year, there's no reservoir of eggs
No.
to then get you through the bad years. So what we see is any system that has 2 or 3 or 4 dams like the Kennebec and the Susquehanna, it just doesn't work. Even with the state-of-the-art engineered fish passage, it just doesn't work.
No. Well, taking those dams out in the Kennebec River and in the Penobscot River, paid huge dividends.
It's done wonders. The Penobscot had an interesting situation. It's a really huge river, had all those species I talked about, and the hydro companies did not want to give up their territory, their power, no pun intended, and there was a long negotiation among Indian tribes that lived along there and agencies and NGOs, and at the end of that, they did something called dam trading, where they didn't get rid of the hydropower, but they took down several dams and did a good fish passage on one of them and moved the turbines to the tributaries so that the main stem was opened. So you still have the tributaries blocked, but now you have a huge amount of water available for big river species like shad and striped bass and sturgeon, and they have just as much power as they had before. So this dam trading concept is one more tool out there in the box that can be used. One idea that I've been exploring lately, and I'm hoping to get deeper into this shortly in a big way, is the idea of breaching dams, taking dams down, big dams, but replacing the power with alternative sources. So we call this the shared river concept, where if you take a dam down, you still have the existing transmission line that brought the power from the hydro turbines to wherever they were used. That's a very expensive part of any energy project. But when you drain the waters of the reservoir, you get back a lot of land, which could be used for solar power. You have, typically with the reservoir, a ring of hills around it where you might be able to put wind power. And you also could capture some of the power of the river through what's called diversionary hydro, where you route some water through, but you don't block the entire river. And if you did that, you would get back your fish runs, and you would get back energy that would probably equal or exceed what you had already, with greater resilience, because you're not counting on water flow alone. You're counting on the sun and the water flow and the wind. And you might have a very resilient energy park. So I'm going to be looking at a number of East Coast rivers that just sort of coming up with scenarios where we might consider doing this. And I know, it's not going to change anybody's mind right away, but we got to start thinking about new ways to solve this problem, because traditional engineered fish passage on large rivers is simply not working. Enrico?
And in the slide you showed where the second dam becomes a major problem for fish, you
Right.
alluded to this issue where the fish get into a lake and don't know which way to go because they don't feel any flow. We've been learning a lot about this and working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, this idea of attractive flow. And,
Right.
And we sort of I always had this notion that if we gave the fish access, that they would use the habitat, but that's not always the case with these fish. They need to feel that flow and know where to go. I guess it's a luxury that we're talking about second dams now. I'm glad we're that far along. But in other places, are there ways to solve that where you get fish into an impoundment and you want them to keep going and they don't necessarily find it? And second, is there a point at which the population grows so much that the density pushes them further upstream?
You could post signs, but other than that, I think around here on Long Island, if you had fish getting to a little pond, it's not going to take long for them to find the shrimp coming in. It's within an hour or two or a day they're going to find it. But in a giant reservoir, they're being dumped into totally still water, and we don't know how long it takes for them to find the next river or the flow, but it does cost them some time. And the big problem with these fishways is even if they work, they are stressing the fish and they're losing time. They are coming back as the end result of fine-tuning evolutionary history to leave salt waters at a time where they end up on the spawning grounds at the right temperature. And if they lose 3 or 4 or 5 weeks getting there, and they're all beat up and tired, you're not going to get a good spawn. So, yeah, that's a problem. Yes?
Just one comment I had about is that one of the things I think we need to address as a community is not just the physical passage issue, but rather there are other barriers that these dams are setting up, especially here on low gradient streams like we have on Long Island, which is thermal barriers that these dams are creating for fish movement. We have in many cases these small impoundments basically heating waters to extremely high temperatures that are changing much of the habitat downstream of them from cold water streams to warm water streams that promote the growth of invasive species. And I think that one of the things that we need to promote is while nature-like bypasses may be a great solution where you can't pull a dam to providing effective physical passage, it isn't going to mitigate the problem that you have with the thermal barrier.
I agree. I think small ponds add heat to small systems.
Right.
And you either have to live with that or not. I think if you decide this park pond is really important to the community, you got to live with it. But if you can justify it, that's one of the reasons you can put in the column for justifying removal. It's a little more problematic with really big hydro dams on big rivers in that in a lot of cases they release water from the lower levels of the dam, and you'll have icily cold water coming down that slipping under the reservoir with warm water on top of it. So you're really screwing up the system temperature-wise. The fish don't know what to make of it because they're leaving a cold ocean to go to a warmer river. They feel cold. They get into the reservoir. It's too warm. It's a mess.
I've been wondering about that in the context of shad, like I think Delaware River, for example. You have discharges coming from the New York DEP reservoirs that are essentially creating a very cold water fishery in something that wouldn't normally have been like that. What effect does that have on the shad runs?
The shad do go into the East Branch, so they go pretty far up. But I would say overall that the Delaware is one of the healthiest rivers now on the East Coast because it doesn't have dams until you get way upriver to the branches. So in some ways, it's about as good as you can get for an East Coast river. I even proposed the idea of having sort of river-type MPAs, river protected areas that serve as touchstones for what rivers should be. The Delaware, even despite its pollution history, would be a great sort of touchstone river because it is undammed up until the headwaters. So I don't think it's suffering much from reservoir effects because it's just too long a river where those effects would get pretty quickly equalized just by the length and local temperatures.
One more question? Any more questions?
Oh, sorry.
I was just curious about the growth of dams over time that you had there. And I think in my mind, I was thinking there were so many more dams in way from the distant past that have persisted because of either. But I was interested in how many more dams, how much growth there was between like 1950 and 2000. And if it's not being driven by things like the need for power, are those things like small dams for the purposes of aesthetics, or what is it? What is that? What accounts for that most recent growth for us?
I think that, if I can go back to that slide, I think that dealt more with the condition of dams.
Is that it? There? Is that
You just passed it.
Go back.
Right there. Back.
Oh, you're talking about this one, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually don't know. I think that in the 50s and 60s, there probably was still, it might have been some small hydro power needs. I don't think, it wasn't for mill power, obviously.
Flood control.
It's a good question. Yeah, flood control, another
I mean, for
one.
example, the Peconic, the Thomasville Dam was built in the 1950s.
Right.
And that was for flood control purposes.
Yeah.
There were several federal policies that encouraged dam building starting in the 40s.
Yeah. We're not seeing a whole lot of dam building going on now, in my opinion, especially not large dams. They're too controversial. Smaller dams, people can kind of sort of do what they want to do. All right.
All right,
Anything else?
great.
Thank you.
Thank you.